weren't kidding.
Yeah.
This Bob Woodward book, War, is packed with some serious revelations.
It is.
Secret COVID tests.
Yeah.
Nuclear close calls.
Right.
It's like we're about to step into a political thriller,
Right.
except this is all too real, and it's happening just as we're gearing up for a presidential election.
And that timing right before an election adds another layer of intrigue to these already significant events.
Right.
It makes you wonder about Woodward's intentions in releasing the book now.
Right. Like he's dropping this bombshell right into the middle of an already chaotic political landscape. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's unpack some of these headline-grabbing moments, starting with this whole COVID test situation with Putin.
Yeah.
What's the deal with Trump sending those scarce rapid testing machines directly to him at the height of the pandemic?
Right.
It's not like we had tests to spare back then.
It's a head-scratcher, for sure.
Right.
What we know, according to Woodward, is that in 2020, when those tests were like gold,
oh, yeah,
Putin, fearing COVID, requested them from Trump.
Wow.
And insisted on absolute secrecy.
Oh, really?
And Trump's alleged response, I don't care.
Wow.
Fine.
Which, knowing how these two operate, almost feels on brand for them.
Right.
But it also speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It does. We have to remember the context here.
Right.
This isn't just any world leader.
Right.
It's Putin we're talking about. And at a time when the U.S. was grappling with the worst public health crisis in recent memory.
Of course.
So for Trump to prioritize Putin's anxieties over the desperate needs of his own people, even if it was just a few testing machines, it raises questions about his priorities, his judgment, and the nature of their relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, what would voters today, especially those who might have struggled to even get tested back then, make of this kind of revelation?
It's certainly ammunition for both sides.
Right.
Trump's critics would likely point to it as further evidence of his questionable judgment and his cozy relationship with a leader many view as an adversary.
Right.
On the other hand, his supporters might argue it was a strategic move. Part of some larger diplomatic play that we're not privy to.
It's all very cloak and dagger, isn't it?
It is.
And speaking of shadowy dealings, what about these alleged phone calls between Trump and Putin after Trump left office?
Right.
That's not exactly standard protocol, is it?
It's certainly unusual to say the least.
Right.
Woodward cites an unnamed source who claims there were maybe as many as 7 calls between them after January 2021. Now, we don't know what was said or if these calls even happened, but the very allegation itself, especially given their history and the current war in Ukraine, is bound to raise eyebrows.
To put it mildly, it's one thing for a former president to maintain relationships with world leaders. It's quite another when that world leader is actively engaged in a war with a U.S. ally.
Exactly. It feeds directly into those existing concerns about Trump's judgment, his allegiances, and whether he can be trusted to put America's interests first when dealing with someone like Putin. And remember, this comes on the heels of Woodward's previous reporting on Trump's stance towards Russia, including that comment about how Putin owned Obama during a 2018 meeting.
The one where he reportedly told his aides to confiscate the interpreter's notes. He's like, this pattern of behavior keeps repeating itself.
It does make you wonder, what is it about Putin that Trump finds so appealing? And more importantly, what does it mean for the future of U.S.-Russia relations if he were to be reelected?
Okay, so we've got Trump potentially playing fast and loose with international diplomacy, both during and after his presidency. Now let's turn to Biden. How does war portray his handling of these global pressures? Did Woodward capture any hot mic moments with Biden like he did with Trump?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
In fact, if you thought Joe Biden was all folksy charm and come on, man, get ready for a different side of him. Woodward paints a picture of Biden as a much more fiery and candid figure behind closed doors.
Wow.
Particularly when it comes to Putin. And surprisingly, Netanyahu.
Biden unleashing on Netanyahu. Now, that's not something you hear every day.
Don't.
What exactly did he say?
Well, Woodward quotes him using some pretty colorful language, to put it mildly. In one instance, Biden reportedly refers to Netanyahu as, and I quote, "That son of a Bibi Netanyahu, he's a bad guy. he's a bad-fessing guy.
Wow. And these weren't just off-the-cuff remarks to someone he was arguing with, right?
I know. These were reportedly made to his advisors within the White House.
Really?
And while they were said during a particularly tense period in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
right,
they reveal a level of frustration and anger with Netanyahu. Yeah. That's rarely, if ever, seen publicly from Biden.
It's like he has this diplomatic public persona,
right,
but then behind the scenes,
he's much more, shall we say, unfiltered.
Right.
Which, depending on your perspective, could be seen as either refreshing or concerning.
Okay, so we've got Biden dropping F-bombs about Bibi.
Right.
What about his interactions with Putin?
Yeah.
Equally fiery.
Just as fiery, if not more so.
Okay.
In the early days of the Ukraine war, when intelligence first surfaced about Russian troop movements on the border,
right,
Woodward describes Biden as initially disbelieving, even saying this would be so crazy.
So even Biden, with his decades of foreign policy experience,
right,
was caught off guard.
It seems that way, at least initially.
Wow.
But once the reality of the situation sunk in,
right,
Woodward describes Biden becoming much more forceful in his dealings with Putin.
Okay.
Directly confronting him about the intelligence, warning him about the potential consequences of an invasion.
Yeah.
He even reportedly said that effing Putin during one Oval Office meeting.
It's almost hard to imagine those words coming out of Biden's mouth,
right,
especially given his more measured presidential public image.
Right.
It makes you wonder how much of what we see from these leaders is carefully calculated.
Yeah.
And how much is genuine raw emotion?
It's a fascinating question.
Right.
And one that Woodward seems to be grappling with throughout the book.
Yeah.
Are these outbursts a liability?
Right.
A sign that these men are perhaps not emotionally equipped to handle the immense pressures of their positions?
Right.
Or could it be that these moments of unvarnished emotion reveal a level of authenticity?
Yeah.
A willingness to say what they really think.
Right.
That's actually refreshing, even if a bit rough around the edges.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned the contrast between public image and private reality, because it seems to be a recurring theme throughout the book.
Right.
And not just with Biden.
Right.
Kamala Harris, for example,
right,
also appears to be walking this tightrope between her role as Biden's VP and her own ambitions as the Democratic nominee.
Right. It's like she's trying to balance loyalty to the current administration with the need to establish her own identity on the world stage.
Exactly.
And wasn't there something in the book about Harris clashing with Netanyahu?
Yes.
Given his tense relationship with Biden?
Right.
That must have made for some interesting conversations.
It certainly did.
Right.
Woodward highlights this fascinating contrast in her approach to Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Particularly regarding the conflict in Gaza.
Okay.
In private, she adopted a much more diplomatic stance.
Really?
Even expressing some sympathy for the plight of the Palestinian people.
Wow.
But publicly, her tone was noticeably different.
Okay.
More critical of Israel's actions.
Right.
Even pledging at one point to not be silent about the suffering of Palestinians.
Which, if I remember correctly, didn't exactly go over well with Netanyahu?
Not at all.
Right.
He reportedly felt blindsided by her public comments.
Yeah.
Seeing them as a betrayal of their private conversations.
Right.
It created a rift between them.
Right.
And some say it even strained relations between the U.S. and Israel.
Wow, that's some high-stakes diplomacy.
It is.
It makes you wonder, was this just a case of Harris miscalculating?
Right.
Or was it a deliberate strategy on her part to distance herself from the administration's more pro-Israel stance?
It's a question worth considering.
Right.
It highlights the delicate balancing act she's been tasked with.
Right.
On the one hand, she needs to show loyalty to Biden and his administration's policies.
Right.
But on the other hand, she needs to establish herself as a leader in her own right.
Right.
Someone with her own distinct voice and vision.
Right.
And sometimes that means taking risks.
Right.
Even if it ruffles a few feathers along the way.
Absolutely. And speaking of those risks,
right,
Woodward also delves into those heart-stopping moments.
Yes.
Where the threat of nuclear war became terrifyingly real.
Right.
Like that period in the fall of 2022.
Right.
When U.S. intelligence indicated that Putin might be seriously considering using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Yes. And this is where the book's title, War, takes on a whole new level of significance.
I bet.
It's a stark reminder that even in the 21st century,
right,
the threat of nuclear annihilation is still very much alive.
It's a chilling thought.
It is.
I have to admit, I don't even really know what tactical nuclear weapons are.
Right.
I mean, aren't all nuclear weapons, by definition, pretty darn tactical?
That's a common misconception.
Okay.
Tactical nuclear weapons, or T&Ws, are designed for battlefield use.
Okay.
As opposed to strategic nuclear weapons, which are larger and intended to target cities and infrastructure far from the front lines.
Right.
T&Ws are still incredibly destructive, of course.
Yeah.
But the thinking is that they could be used in a more limited way without necessarily triggering a full-blown nuclear exchange.
Okay, that makes sense. But it still doesn't make the thought of them being used any less terrifying.
Right.
So what was the response from the Biden administration when they received that intelligence about Putin?
Well, according to Woodward, it was all hands on deck to de-escalate the situation.
Okay.
They initiated frantic back-channel communications with Russian officials trying to get a read on Putin's intentions.
Right.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin reportedly delivered a crystal-clear message to his Russian counterpart.
Okay.
Any use of nuclear weapons, tactical or otherwise, would be met with swift and severe consequences.
So basically a high-stakes game of chicken with the fate of the world hanging in the balance.
Why?
Did they ever get a sense of what Putin's endgame was?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And according to Woodward, even those closest to Putin, even those within his own inner circle, weren't entirely sure what he was thinking.
Wow.
The U.S. had to rely on a combination of intelligence gathering, including, reportedly, a high-level human source inside the Kremlin and direct communication to try and decipher Putin's next move.
It's like something out of a John le Carré novel, except with much higher stakes.
Right. It's a chilling reminder of the complexities and dangers of international relations.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with a leader as unpredictable as Putin.
Of course.
And it's not just Russia we have to worry about, is it?
Right.
The book also touches on the role of Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Right.
Or MBS, as he's often called.
Right, the whole Game of Thrones aspect of global politics.
Right.
And MBS seems to be a major player in this arena.
He does.
What's his deal? He seems to have good relationships with both Trump and Biden, even though they have vastly different approaches to foreign policy.
That's what makes MBS such a fascinating and some might say unsettling figure.
Right.
He's portrayed as a shrewd operator,
a
master manipulator who understands how to leverage power, both through Saudi Arabia's vast oil wealth and his personal relationships with key players like Trump and Biden.
It's interesting, though, because you'd think Biden's stance on human rights, especially given the whole Jamal Khashoggi situation, would have created more friction between them.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Right.
And to be fair, Woodward does suggest that Biden is wary of MBS.
Okay.
Particularly in light of the CIA's conclusion that the Crown Prince himself ordered Khashoggi's brutal murder.
Right. For those who might not remember, Khashoggi was a Saudi journalist and Washington Post columnist who was highly critical of MBS.
Right.
He was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018.
Right.
And the CIA concluded that MBS had ordered the killing.
Correct.
It was a huge international scandal.
Huge.
Right.
And it cast a long shadow over U.S.-Saudi relations.
Of course.
But despite this, MBS has managed to maintain a surprising level of influence in Washington.
Is that just because of oil? Or is there something else at play?
It's a combination of factors.
Okay.
Oil is undoubtedly a major one.
Right.
Saudi Arabia remains a crucial swing producer in the global oil market.
Yeah.
And they have a history of using their oil production as leverage in geopolitical negotiations.
Of course.
But MBS is also playing a longer game.
Right.
He's cultivated relationships with key figures in both parties.
Right.
Positioning himself as a valuable ally.
Right.
Someone who can get things done.
Right.
Whether it's brokering deals in the Middle East. Or influencing oil prices.
He sounds like a master strategist.
Right.
Albeit one with a rather ruthless streak.
Right.
And speaking of MBS and his connections,
yes.
What about that story about Lindsey Graham and the burner phones?
Oh, you mean the one where Graham reportedly called Trump on a burner phone?
Yes.
That MBS kept specifically for calls with Trump?
Yes.
Yes, that's a classic Woodward detail, isn't it?
Sure.
It's both comical and a little unnerving.
I mean, on the one hand, it's almost comical to picture this powerful prince carrying around a bag of burner phones.
Right.
Each one labeled with the name of a world leader.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's a stark reminder of the kind of access and influence MBS wields.
Exactly. And it raises all sorts of questions, like who else does he have on speed dial?
Right.
And what kind of favors are being traded behind the scenes?
It's a side of international diplomacy we rarely get to see, this tangled web of personal relationships and backroom dealings.
Right.
It's like a geopolitical game of chess.
It is.
With everyone making their moves and counter moves.
And in this game, information is power.
Right.
Which brings us back to Woodward's book.
Right.
One of the things war does so effectively is it gives us this fly-on-the-wall perspective on this game, showing us how these leaders operate, both in the public eye and behind closed doors.
And what's fascinating is it's not always pretty. You see their tempers flare, their vulnerabilities exposed, and their strategic calculations laid bare.
Exactly. Right. And sometimes those moments of frustration, those unguarded comments, can be incredibly revealing. Right. Like when Biden reportedly referred to Senator Joe Manchin as a fucking asshole.
Wow.
During a particularly tense negotiation over his legislative agenda.
Wow. That's quite the contrast to Biden's public persona of trying to unify the country and reach across the aisle.
It is. But it also speaks to the immense pressure Biden was under to get his agenda passed.
Right.
Especially in a Senate as closely divided as it was. Right. Every vote counted.
Right.
And Manchin, as a moderate Democrat, held a lot of sway.
Right. It was like pulling teeth trying to get anything through Congress. Right. But still, you'd think he'd be a little more careful with his language, even in private.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Right.
But I suppose it just goes to show that even the most seasoned politicians are human.
Right.
They get frustrated.
Right.
They vent, and sometimes they let slip a few choice words they probably shouldn't.
Yeah, and according to Woodward, those choice words seem to involve a fair amount of profanity coming from Biden.
It does seem to be a bit of a recurring theme, doesn't it?
Right.
But in all seriousness, these glimpses into Biden's more unfiltered side, while perhaps entertaining, also reveal something important about his character.
Right.
He's clearly someone who feels things deeply, who's passionate about his beliefs, and who's not afraid to fight for what he thinks is right, even if it means ruffling a few feathers along the way.
It's a side of him we don't often see in the carefully curated world of public appearances and prepared statements.
Right.
Speaking of that human side, war also touches on some very personal moments, like Biden's relationship with his son, Hunter.
Yes, and this is where we see a different side of Biden.
Okay.
A more vulnerable and perhaps relatable side. Woodward describes a scene where Hunter visits his father at the White House and confides in him about his personal struggles.
Right.
Biden doesn't offer any easy answers, but you can sense his concern and empathy as a father.
It's a reminder that behind the political maneuvering and the weight of the world, these are still real people with real families and real emotions.
Precisely. And in Biden's case, family has always been a driving force, both in his personal life and his political career.
Right.
It's what grounds him, what motivates him, and it adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of him as a leader.
It makes you wonder how much of his decision-making is shaped by that desire to protect his family, to shield them from the harsh realities of the world he operates in.
It's an intriguing question.
Right.
And speaking of Biden's decision-making,
yes,
the book also sheds light on his decision to run for re-election.
Okay.
Or perhaps more accurately, his initial reluctance to do so.
Oh, I hadn't heard about that. What made him hesitate?
Right.
You'd think after all this time in Washington, she'd be champing at the bit for another 4 years.
Well, according to Woodward, Biden had some reservations.
Really?
And understandably so.
Okay.
He was already the oldest person ever to serve as president.
Right.
The job takes a toll. Both physically and emotionally. And there was always the risk that he could lose.
Of course.
Potentially tarnishing his legacy.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is.
So what changed his mind?
Well, Woodward points to a conversation Biden had with his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I don't know much about Lincoln.
Right.
What's his relationship with Biden like?
They're incredibly close.
Okay.
Blinken has been by Biden's side for decades.
Okay.
Serving as his top advisor during his time as vice president.
Right.
He's someone Biden trusts implicitly.
Okay.
Someone he relies on for his judgment and candor. And according to Woodward, Blinken didn't hold back in this conversation.
Okay.
He reportedly laid out the potential consequences for Biden's legacy. If he were to run and lose.
Wow. That's a bold move.
It is.
Having that kind of frank conversation with the president of the United States.
It is, but it speaks to the level of trust and respect between them.
Right.
And ultimately, I think Biden recognized the validity of Blinken's concerns.
So Blinken's words carried a lot of weight.
They did.
Right.
And beyond that, I think Biden also recognized the gravity of the moment.
Yeah.
We're living through a time of unprecedented global instability.
Right.
From the war in Ukraine to the rise of authoritarianism around the world.
Right.
And Biden, with his decades of experience in foreign policy, likely felt a sense of duty to stay in the game, to continue leading on the world stage.
It's a heavy burden to bear.
It is.
You almost have to feel for these leaders regardless of your political leanings.
Right.
They're grappling with problems most of us can't even begin to fathom. It's true. And Woodward doesn't shy away from showing the human toll these decisions take on these individuals. The sleepless nights, the constant pressure, the weight of knowing that their choices have life or death consequences.
And yet they keep going. They answer the call to service. Even when it means sacrificing their privacy. Their sanity, and sometimes even their personal relationships.
It's a testament to their resilience. Their sense of duty, and
Yeah.
perhaps a bit of stubborn determination.
And maybe a few more F-bombs than we realize, at least in Biden's case. But in all seriousness, this book paints a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, portrait of the world stage.
It does.
And the individuals who operate on it. It's a reminder that even in the age of social media and instant news, so much of what shapes our world happens behind closed doors, in those hushed conversations and tense negotiations we rarely get a glimpse of. Exactly. And that's why books like War are so important. They pull back the curtain, giving us a glimpse into the minds of those who hold the fate of the world in their hands. It's true. We often forget that these world leaders, for all their power and influence, are still human beings operating within a system that's inherently messy and unpredictable.
And speaking of unpredictable, we can't forget about the elephant in the room, so to speak. Trump is running for re-election.
He is.
What does War tell us about his intentions, his state of mind if he were to return to the Oval Office? Especially given everything we've just discussed about his relationships with leaders like Putin and MBS.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While Woodward doesn't have all the answers, he does offer some intriguing and some might say alarming glimpses into Trump's post-presidency behavior and mindset.
Like those alleged phone calls with Putin we discussed earlier.
Yes, those are certainly cause for concern. But there's also this telling anecdote about Lindsey Graham visiting Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Graham reportedly told someone, and I quote, "Going to Mar-a-Lago is a little bit like going to North Korea. Everybody stands up and claps every time Trump comes in."
So the cult of personality is alive and well.
It seems so. And according to Woodward, Graham was also worried about Trump's fixation on the 2020 election. Urging him to move on and let go of the past.
Which, knowing Trump, is like asking the sun not to rise. Do you think these accounts suggest that Trump has truly learned from his time in office? That he'd approach these global challenges any differently the second time around?
That's the big unknown. There are moments in the book where Woodward portrays Trump as reflective, even acknowledging some of the mistakes he made during his presidency. But there are just as many moments where he seems stuck in the past, consumed by grievances and conspiracy theories.
It's like he's pulled in two different directions. The statesman versus the showman?
Exactly. And I think that's the essential tension that Woodward lays bare. It's not just about Trump's policies, but about his temperament, his fitness for office. Can he be trusted to navigate the complexities of the world stage, to make rational, well-informed decisions when the stakes are so incredibly high?
It's a question that voters will have to grapple with as they head to the polls.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about Trump or Biden, is it? It's about the kind of leadership we need in a world facing such daunting challenges.
Precisely. War isn't just a book about the past. It's a cautionary tale for the present. It's a reminder that the decisions these leaders make have real-world consequences. Not just for Americans, but for people all over the globe.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
So as we head into this election with all its noise and distractions, it's worth remembering that we're not just choosing a president.
That's right.
We're choosing someone to lead us through a world on edge. A world where the stakes have never been higher.
And that choice, my friend, deserves our full attention, our careful consideration, and perhaps most importantly, our willingness to look beyond the sound bites and the slogans.
Right.
And to grapple with the complex realities that lie beneath the surface.
It's a call to action for all of us.
Absolutely.
To stay informed, to engage in thoughtful dialogue, and to demand better from our leaders.
Yes.
Because ultimately, as war so powerfully reminds us, the future of our world depends on it.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.